Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the fast-moving relationship between the USA and Venezuela, and why this represents bad news for China and even worse news for Russia. Now, if you've been following events, you'll be aware that the USA have removed Nicolas Maduro, and he's now been replaced by his former vice president, who's now become the president. But as Donald Trump has said on multiple occasions, the USA is running the country. And by way of proving that, he's posted on Truth Social this statement, which says, "I am pleased to announce that the interim authorities in Venezuela will be turning over between 30 and 50 million barrels of high-quality sanctioned oil to the United States of America. This oil will be sold at its market price, and that money will be controlled by me, as President of the United States of America, to ensure that it is used to benefit the people of Venezuela and the United States!" I've asked Energy Secretary Chris Wright to execute this plan immediately. It will be taken by storage ships and brought directly to unloading docks in the United States. Thank you for your attention on this matter. And it's been reported that Chevron has actually chartered 11 tankers and they're now on their way to Venezuela. And this is interesting because the blockade that's been in place by the USA has actually stopped tankers going backwards and forwards. And it's been reported that Venezuela has such a glut of oil at the moment that they were actually on the verge of having to stop production. So they're going to have to close down their oil wells. And there is a question here as to the timing of the removal of Nicolas Maduro. It does look like the USA were monitoring what was happening with the oil industry. And as that oil industry was getting to breaking point, the US decided to take some action. So oil has definitely been a big player in terms of the timing of the removal of Maduro. Now, in terms of assessing the importance of this movement of oil from Venezuela to the USA, I thought it was worth having a look at the historic relationship. So this chart shows the amount of oil being imported into the US from Venezuela dating back to 2000. And what this shows is that at the start of the noughties, the USA was actually importing around 1.3 million barrels of oil every single day from Venezuela. But as the sanctions started to increase, you can see that the amount of oil being imported was going down. And then by 2018, it had got down to around about 500,000 barrels per day. We then had the full round of sanctions that were introduced following the election of Nicolas Maduro. And you can see that since that time, there's been virtually nothing being imported. There was an increase back in 23 and 24, and this was as a result of the license that was issued to Chevron to allow it to move some oil to try to recover all of the money that was owed to it. And just as a reminder in terms of the history of what went on in Venezuela, in 1976, all of the US assets were taken by the state as part of the communist movement. They were then re-invited back into the country in the 1990s. So we had Chevron, ExxonMobil, and ConocoPhillips went back in and started producing oil again. And then in 2007, the then president said that he wanted to change the rule book and that Venezuela wanted a bigger slice of the profits. At that point, ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips exited the country. Chevron signed the New Deal. So from 2007 onwards, it was really only Chevron that was doing any movement of oil back to the USA. But the reason why I wanted to show this is to show that the level of imports from Venezuela have basically fallen off a cliff from the USA's point of view. And as I said in a previous video, the USA is now a net importer of oil. It consumes more oil than it produces. So it needs to find oil from somewhere. And it's quite handy that this relationship has started up again, because if we have a look at where the US crude oil stocks are at the moment, they are running at really low levels. This chart, which is taken from the official statistics that are published every month by the USA, shows the amount of crude oil stocks dating back to the start of 2024. Now, the black shaded section here shows the 5-year range. So on average, this shows how much oil the US has in its oil stocks. And you can see that that range goes between around about 420 million barrels up to about 540 million. So quite a big range. Now, if we look at the blue line that's been plotted here, This shows the weekly totals over the past couple of years. And if we look at the far right-hand side, which shows the current situation, you can see that the blue line is sitting right at the bottom of the 5-year range. So the USA's current stock levels are at the lowest that they've had on average for 5 years. So the US wants to rebuild those stock levels. It wants to build it back up. The reason why they've gone down is because they've been dipping into them. They've been actually releasing some of the oil that's been stored rather than buying it in the open market. So in order to build these stock levels back up, obviously the USA needs to find a low-cost way of doing that. And this new relationship with Venezuela has come at a very good time. And in terms of answering the question as to how long Donald Trump has been considering this action against Venezuela, I was recently sent this clip, which is taken from a speech that he made in June 24 as part of his presidential election campaign.
How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door. But now we're buying oil from Venezuela, so we're making a dictator very rich. Can you believe this? Nobody can believe it. You know where the oil, their oil is garbage. It's horrible. The worst you can get, tar. It's like tar. And to refine it, you need special plants.
Well, luckily for the USA, they've got lots of those special plants on the Gulf Coast. So US refineries are actually benefiting. They're going to get these 50 million barrels of oil, plus the ongoing supply of oil. Now, just before we go on to talk about what the impact of all of this is going to be on China and Russia, can I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscriber button? It really helps with the algorithm, also puts a smile on my face. And also I wanted to talk to you about my competition whereby you can win my beach house. I've got a house located close to one of the best beaches in the UK, and rather than selling it, I've decided to give it away as part of a competition. To join that competition, you need to buy a ticket. So if you have a look at the QR code on the screen now, you can see that they're priced at £5 each. You can get some bonus deals if you buy multiple tickets. So please have a look at the independent company that's hosting that competition for me. This is another way of funding the channel. Rather than sending me a YouTube super thanks or buying me a coffee or signing up as a Patreon member, you can buy a ticket and it's a bit more fun, and you never know, you might win. As we saw earlier in the video, the USA basically had stopped buying oil from Venezuela. And that left Venezuela with a problem. What was it going to do? How was it going to be able to fund the country with all of the sanctions in place from the USA and the West? Well, the main beneficiary of the sanctions in place against Venezuela has been China. They've been buying the vast majority of Venezuelan oil, and the reason why they're doing it is because they haven't put any sanctions in place against Venezuela, and they're able to buy at a huge discount against the global market. They've been buying at around a $20 discount over the past few years, but unfortunately, that situation is now going to end. And I thought it was worth looking at the direct economic impact on China. So I've got two examples here. The first one is the 50 million barrels that Donald Trump has just announced are going to be moved to the USA. Previously, they would have been going to China. And if we look at what the impact of that is economically, at a discount of $20 per barrel, that equates to $1 billion. So what that means is that China is now going to have to go into the open market, just go into the oil markets and buy those 50 million barrels from somebody else. It will have to pay full market price. And so that oil is going to cost China $1 billion more. The situation's actually worse than that because that isn't the annual amount of oil that China was taking from Venezuela. It's around about 175 million barrels per year. So at a $20 discount, that means that China has just lost $3.5 billion of discount. So it's going to have to pay $3.5 billion more every single year to keep that oil coming in, because China, like the USA, is a net importer of oil. And unfortunately, they've just lost their cheapest source. And if you've been following the channel, you'll know that the other problem that China is facing is that the USA recently sanctioned the two biggest oil companies in Russia, Rosneft and Lukoil, and that's where China was also buying a lot of oil from. So Chinese companies are now having to be very careful in terms of placing orders with Russia, because if they're seen to be placing orders with the two biggest companies, which quite frankly are the two biggest exporters, then all of the Chinese companies and all of the Chinese financial institutions involved run the risk of being hit with sanctions themselves. And as we've talked about in many videos before, the vast majority of China's exports go to the rest of the world. Russia only makes up a very small percentage of China's exports, around about 2 or 3%. So 97 or 98% of China's income comes from everywhere else. So it can't run the risk of being hit with those secondary sanctions. So China is seeing a huge increase in the cost of all of the oil that it's having to buy in, firstly, as a result of the sanctions against Russia, and now secondly, as a result of the loss of the oil that it was previously taking from Venezuela. But the situation from Russia's perspective is actually worse because Russia has a long-standing relationship with Venezuela. They've both got a communist ideology historically, and so they've been long-term allies. And Russia's actually been a long-term partner in the oil industry in Venezuela. Rosneft and a lot of other big Russian oil companies have invested billions of dollars and have lots of joint venture arrangements currently in place with Venezuela. Now, Russia doesn't need the oil. It's not doing it because it wants to import the oil into its country in the same way as China does, but it wants to help develop Venezuela. Firstly, because it was a long-term partner, but secondly, there's also profit to be made for all of the Russian companies because they can get a share of all of the oil that is being produced and sold. So all that oil that was being sold to China, potentially Russia would have been owed some of that money. And Russia has actually lent Venezuela billions of dollars on top of the money that it's invested into the country. Now, all of that is now out of the window because the USA is in control of Venezuela. It's in control of the Venezuelan oil industry. So Russia is not going to see a penny of any future profits, and it's very unlikely that it will ever get any of its investment or any of the debt money back because the sanctions are in place against Russia. So clearly those sanctions will now apply to anything Venezuelan. But the relationship between the two countries has also broken down because we're seeing a change of regime in Venezuela. And I think it's likely over the medium term that we will see a movement away from this communist ideology, more towards a capitalist open market approach. So Russia is losing out because of the direct relationship, but also Russia is going to suffer as a result of Venezuelan oil re-entering the global markets, because what we are seeing at the moment is that oil prices are going down because we've already got an oversupply. OPEC Plus have been increasing the amount of oil in the market. That's been driving down prices over the past 12 months or so. They're now down to less than $60 per barrel. And if Venezuela is able to increase the amount of oil that it's producing, which is very likely with US investment, then that means that more oil will be coming into the global markets, and the oil markets are very finely balanced. So as more oil enters the market, it's going to drive down price. And I thought it was worth having a look at what the impact of this will be on the Russian economy, because Russia is still totally dependent on oil revenue for its economy. And Russia exports around about 6.9 million barrels of oil every single day. That's a lot of oil. So if we say a $1 price drop, then that means that Russia would lose $6.9 million per day, which equates to $2.5 billion over the course of 12 months. But if oil prices go down by $5 a barrel, which is very likely, I think, because we've got this oversupply, plus we're seeing a slowdown in the global economy anyway, so we've got a double whammy impact. If it goes down by $5, that means that Russia would lose $34.5 million per day, which is $12.6 billion per year. And if it goes down by $10, which is possible because we've seen oil prices down at $50 per barrel in the last 10 years, it's totally feasible, then Russia would lose $69 million per day, equating to more than $25 billion. So I really wanted to just bring this to your attention, that Russia is losing out because of its relationship with Venezuela, but more importantly, Russia is going to really suffer as the price of oil goes down, which will happen as Venezuelan oil output is increased and that enters the global market. So I really wanted to make this video just to highlight what's going on between the USA and Venezuela. It's good news for the USA because they've now secured a guaranteed supply of oil. That oil is going to be coming in at a lower price. American businesses are going to benefit. So we're going to see companies like Chevron, possibly ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips will also benefit if they go back in. We're also seeing benefits for the US refineries that are going to be receiving all of this additional oil that they're ready to process. So the US is seeing happy days at the moment, but unfortunately for China and Russia, it represents serious problems. China are now going to have to source more oil in the open markets, which is going to cost them more money every single year. And Russia are going to have to watch as their relationship with Venezuela starts to dwindle and disappear. And also, as global oil prices go down, they're going to see a continued loss of revenue. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking, getting you to think about things in a different way, what the knock-on implications of something happening can be all across the world. That's what I'm trying to do. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I'm running my competition at the moment, whereby you can support the channel by buying a ticket to win my house, located close to one of the best beaches in the UK. If you're not interested in that, then you've got a cash alternative of £250,000 in cash, which is pretty interesting, I think. So have a look at the QR code on the screen now. It'll take you through to buy a ticket. Thank you if you do that. Thank you also to everyone who's supported me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member or buy me coffee member, really, really appreciate that long-term support. Thank you so much. And here's something to put a smile on your face.